I think the world we're likely moving towards, where you're going to have much more consumer-facing offerings and, serviced energy offerings. We talk about heat as a service and things like that. That is a very different risk profile from what you've got at the moment. So it's likely, I would suspect, you don't know because you're going to see what happens with innovation, that would lead to a more sophisticated kind of retail energy supply market, which I think is a good thing.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today is the Director of Strategy and Performance at the Energy Systems Catapult. Now, for those that don't know, the Energy Systems Catapult is a not-for-profit organization focused on bridging the gap between industry, government, academia, and research. Before this, my guest had a diverse career across the energy sector, starting his career as a non-energy journalist in the UK and then Hong Kong. He joined Policy Exchange, which is a leading UK think tank, and became its head of environment and energy. He was head of policy at OVO Energy, which was then one of the emerging retailers in the UK market and has gone on to become a substantial supplier, one of the largest in the UK. And he's also been a special advisor to two Secretary of States for Energy in Amber Rudd and Greg Clark. My guest on the show today is Guy Newey. Welcome, Guy.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, well, delighted to have you here. And I'd like to start with your professional experience. So as a journalist, journalist that's moved into quite detailed policy area, does your experience help you, do you think?
Both helps and hinders, I would say. So the kind of key skill of a journalist, particularly a news journalist, as I was, is getting to the point quickly. So can you identify out of this massive information the thing that the reader is actually going to care about very quickly? So when you're in journalism school, you spend hours being presented with a load of information and then writing 25 words, 50 words of the most important thing. And that's basically what you do. And that is a hugely useful skill, certainly for when you're dealing with ministers, dealing with stakeholders in the jobs that I've done, just like getting to the point, not getting seeing the wood for the trees. All of those things are really important. Clarity of communication is really important. Pretty much anything you do going forward. Understanding the media is very important, both in my special advisor roles, but also thinking about when we're talking to innovators at the Catapult, how they communicate their message, etc. The downsides are limited attention span, kind of surface level rather than getting in depth, and that's ultimately why I personally got a bit frustrated with it and went into areas where I was really delving into a subject, in this case, energy.
Interesting. It's interesting what you say about the value of clear communication, and I think my gut feeling, I don't know what your perception is, but clever people and quantitative people actually struggle with this more than others. And so you get people who are, and when I was doing a PhD in economics, the Nobel laureates, you would think, in economics, at least from my perspective, you would think, okay, these guys must be the smartest guys in the field. And they were super smart and they worked super hard, but they're also phenomenally good at communicating and telling a story and engaging with readers. And I think it sort of struck me even at that early stage that even in academia, where you would think it's all about the ideas and not about the communication is really, really important. And
you see those people in the energy debate who are the great communicators, who people want to talk to, people want to get their ideas. Whether that's Dieter's the kind of classic in the academic space, just an incredible ability to articulate his point of view. And there's others across the space, but it does make you stand out in the same way as it makes you stand out with politics. It's kind of those brilliant communicators, that magic they've got is gold dust.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other experience was you had time in Hong Kong. You had a few years in Hong Kong. And obviously, a lot has changed in Hong Kong over the last couple of years. Back then, did you envisage relations between Hong Kong and mainland China evolving the way that they have? Did you see it as an inevitability, or have you been surprised over the last few years?
I've not been particularly surprised. You were seeing examples of the mainland's influence, as it were, in Hong Kong, increasing all the time, and the Chinese famously play a very long game, as it were. So I'm not surprised. I find it incredibly sad. I haven't been back to Hong Kong for a while, so I'm not close enough to the detail. But Hong Kong's a kind of special place, and a special place in China, and I hope it doesn't lose that uniqueness going forward. And I got into energy and environment issues basically being in Hong Kong, because I was working in the 62nd floor of this amazing view over Victoria Harbour, one of the great views of the world. And for a lot of the days, I couldn't see out the window. You couldn't see, because you were kind of breathing in China's incredible growth with all its benefits for China and its people. And so my kind of question that's been at the heart of what I've done since is, can you have all the benefits of growth whilst not destroying your environment at the same time? And I think that's still the question we're all trying to grapple with in the environment movement.
That's so interesting. We had Jonathan Maxwell on recently, who's an investor, and almost exactly the same story of, I was in and around China during this, accession to the WTO in whenever it was, 2001, 99, huge boom in coal consumption, industrialization, and it was the air pollution that sort of pushed him in the direction of environmentalism. It's interesting. I think a lot of people's journeys parallel that, right? It's sort of you can't see carbon, you could see air pollution, and that's the thing that makes you say, well, hang on, this doesn't quite feel right. That's
certainly how it worked for me. I mean, as well as being in Hong Kong, I spent a lot of time in Beijing, including in the Olympics, and air pollution was such a political story then, and Beijing was doing pretty extreme things. If your number plates, half the cars weren't allowed on the streets for weeks beforehand, etc. And everyone was kind of looking at the US Embassy air pollution gauge, because that's the one that everyone trusted. It's like, is it going to be clean enough, etc. So yeah, that was my gateway into thinking about environment and stuff. And then you get into climate, and it's kind of seductive, fascinating, challenging story that it is.
And Hong Kong's story, in a sense, is a story of being a magnet for talent from people around the world. You must still know people there. Do you get the sense that the calculus of a career or a stint in Hong Kong is changing now, and it will be more of a challenge to attract and retain people?
I don't know, and I'm cautious about voicing that, because expat life is very good at existing in a bubble away from the kind of most the kind of people who live there permanently, and Hong Kong's still got huge attractions. So I wouldn't want to overplay it, but I can't believe it's not having some impinging effect on there. And part of the attractiveness of a place like Hong Kong is a vibrant media that's kicking the crap out of the government half the time, and all of that scrutiny that goes from that, which makes it vibrant commercial place, etc. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to. I'm not close enough to it now, but it's certainly likely.
Yeah, it feels like we'll have to wait and see. Just one other topic I wanted to pick up from your career to date. So you're at OVO. as head of policy. You were there for about a year and a half, and then started working for the Secretary of State. We focused a bit on this podcast around these sorts of challenges in the UK market, in the GB power market. We had Greg Jackson from Octopus on, and I think there's a sort of billion dollar question here around the scalability of that business model globally. They've taken a big chunk out of the UK market, and you've moved from a big six to having some big suppliers, more of them, but also a different set of people in that top echelon of suppliers. Do you think, and so Greg's view was, look, John, the technology is really scalable. We've got this software platform called Kraken. OVO has one, Kaluza, that underpins the operations. Apparently it's a step up on what SAP or whoever was doing before, and that scales globally. Do you think we could be in a world in which we have big supply companies, like we've got big oil and gas companies or something like that dominate in many markets? Or having been in policy, do you think the benefits of being local and being a national supplier close to people, those sorts of things are too strong?
I absolutely think there could be there could be big multinationals with scale effects, because partly because you've got a bunch of incredible entrepreneurs kicking around in this space, whether it's pioneers like Juliet at Good Energy, or Steve at OVO, and Greg at Octopus, or Hayden at Bolt. There's just a brilliant cohort of hyper competitive people who want to do the right thing. But more importantly, the profound change, and we'll probably get onto this later, the profound change that's happening in energy around the digitalization of energy, and what that means in the climate change context, means that there's absolutely no reason that energy, which will always have local characteristics, of course it will, but when you're talking about the kind of lightly heavy renewables, heavily flexible world that we're moving to, digitalization is going to be the kind of the glue, or whatever the right metaphor is, that makes sure that works, and companies that can crack that are going to be best placed. And that's going to be this, that's the same challenge in the UK as it is in Germany, as it is in Japan, etc. So and that's why you see OVOs and Octopuses now, they're kind of dipping their toes in other markets, and in some cases more than that. So.
Yeah, it's certainly not hard to believe that the software solution to the sector now is just entirely different to the one that succeeded 10 years ago, and I suppose the integration with the hardware as well, in all sorts of ways as well. Can we move on to the Energy Systems Catapult? So the mission of just to understand its role within the sector. So the mission is to capture the clean growth opportunity. Is part of the kind of the organizations have a stated mission. Aurora has a stated mission. Do you think much? So there's an opportunity there, but do you think much about trying to avoid clean growth costs as well as capitalizing on the opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. The two things are very closely related in our mind, and how we approach it. The Catapult's job, as it were, is to work with companies large and small to really work out how their product or service is going to play into this incredible opportunity, which is the net zero transition. So that could be small companies like Ventive, who are trying to come up with a kind of one box solution, which will have your heat pump, your air conditioning, your battery, etc., all in one thing that's easy to install in a low carbon way in your actually outside your house. It goes into your house. You've got companies like SunAmp, you've got thermal energy storage, etc. So our job is, at the smaller end, help them think about what the market opportunity is, what might be the consumer proposition that they would develop, etc. Really support them that way, and then at the same time helping companies, big multinationals making the transition, Shell, EDF. Where are the big macro opportunities? So our modeling environment, thinking about what future role of CCS might be, or nuclear, or large scale storage, etc. And the kind of, if we're doing well, we're helping all of those companies make money from the transition. But of course, the transition is much more likely, and I'm of the view that, you've got the climate change targets, and some people in the debate kind of think, well, we've got the climate change targets, they're law, we're absolutely going to have to meet them. And I'm enough of a political animal to know that at some point people might just go, no, you're right. This is too hard for us, etc. And consumers have a big role to play, particularly as we go to the next phase. So making low carbon products and services which are better, and part of that is cheaper, part of that is more cost effective, is absolutely essential. And it's the kind of thing the mantra we talk to our companies all the time. How do we see the success that we've seen in renewables, in offshore wind, for example? How do we recreate that in low carbon heating offers, etc.? And just one subtle point, I used to always focus on the cheaper side. Certainly in my policy exchange days, it was all about greener, cheaper, right? And I think for electricity, that's probably the case. But actually, when you're getting into transport and you're getting into heating, it's actually got to be better as well. It's got to be something that people really want and desire, because whilst climate change is a big motivator for some groups of people, and it's generally received particular support, most people are not going to, if it's a trade-off between quality of life and climate change, they're not going to be. Of course, it doesn't have to be, and again, that's what we see with some of the brilliant companies we work with, is like, how do we make cost-effective options for decarbonising?
Interesting. Now, I'd like to spend most of our time on a recent report you've launched called Rethinking Electricity Markets. And there are a number of aspects of that. Before I get into that report and your findings and proposals, one thing that you mentioned there was around cheaper not necessarily being enough, or not necessarily being a key focus for heat and transport. Mm-hmm. I think for all of us, that's pretty clear in transport. We see how much people spend on a Tesla. We know that that's not the cheapest option. If you want 100% electricity, it doesn't. There are other factors at play. When it comes to heat, this seems more complicated. I mean, maybe I'm not I don't have enough imagination here, but what's the biggest impediment, do you think, in the UK, in a northern European climate where gas is a dominant source of, heat, doesn't get super cold over winter, but it gets pretty cold. What's the biggest impediment to the decarbonisation of heat in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, this is one area that we at the Catapult spend a huge amount of time thinking about. I mean, the biggest barrier is consumers looking at the alternatives, right? Because gas boilers and the gas system is great. It's just it's pretty cost effective. There's a supply chain that's relatively mature, etc. It works reasonably well. It's certainly much better than what people had previously. Central heating is an extraordinary innovation. I would say, actually, if you look at it compared to other services in our lives, our heating experience is actually often quite rubbish. I mean, work we've done, we say 2/3 of people think that suffer from drafts or damp or mold or overheating, or they can't get the thermostat right, etc. And partly that's because we live in the UK context in some pretty ropey buildings. We like living in old buildings which look nice but are pretty rubbish to heat, etc. But generally we've got quite a good we've got a good mature heating industry, etc. And you've got consumers who are used to it and like moving forward. So that's the biggest barrier. The question is, can you come up with something which is better than that, which is a much better heating experience? They get much better control, perhaps room by room control. They allowed to identify faults. They can work out whether energy efficiency measures actually work in their home. The actual performance is going on. Oh, and by the way, it happens to be low carbon, because it's worth saying that whilst there's good general support for decarbonisation, 47% of people that in our work don't think that don't realise that their gas boiler is contributing to climate change. Think of the journey you've got to take those people on, right? They want to do something about climate change. They think it's all about, plastic straws and flying, etc. And there's a bit of that, but they don't quite realize their heating system is contributing to the problem. So you've got to get them on that journey. And that is only going to work at the scale we want if we have things which are really desirable, that people go, bloody hell, that's great. I always say to people, the comparison is, we've in the UK, we've done the 2030 ban on internal combustion engines, the hybrid extension. We couldn't have done that 10 years ago when the only things driving around were gee whizzes.
Yeah.
You couldn't have done that politically. But when there's Teslas and, Hyundais and Volkswagens and Nissans driving around, which are desirable, still not cheap enough for most people. We've got to work on that, etc. But it's a political sell. But that's what we've got to do in heat, is get some offers in the market, and that's not just about tech; it's about services as well. And whoever can capture that market is, it's huge. It's huge. Yeah. 1.5 million boilers installed a year.
It's in terms of megawatt hours. It's whatever 4 times the size of the power market in general. Yeah. Okay, so I think you've conveyed that it's pretty complicated, but you've also emphasised offering a better product. And from what you say, I totally agree with you. The British are good at all sorts of things, but heat in their homes is not one. You ask Merkel Someone asked Merkel what she associates most with Germany, and she said a well-made window. And I don't think anyone would associate heat or anything high, good quality about insulation with Britain in general. So that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the Rethinking Electricity Markets report. And I want to start. One of the things you start with is consumers. Again, unsurprisingly. So you basically, one of the challenges you level at the existing system is, you say there's been a failure to unlock sufficient flexibility, particularly on the demand side, and to bring forward consumer-friendly service innovation. Can you say, sort of in a few points, what has the impediment been? What's the problem been for consumers in unlocking flexibility?
Yeah, so again, it's back. So just to take it to upper levels, back to this point of you need, as well as the heating side, where you need a much better, consumer offer. If we're going to make this whole, much more electrified, much more intermittent, renewable, heavy system work, we can just build and build and build and build and build at the supply end, at the generation end. Or we can get a system which is much more flexible and can move load between the days, using digital technology as a kind of enabler of that. And that's if you things you can be confident of in the energy sector, it's going to be much more windier. It's going to be much more EVs on the system. There's huge potential, etc. But right now, but in order to unlock that system benefit, you're going to have to do 2 things. One, you're going to have to get an actual incentive in the market for people to do it, as it were. So you've got Octopus with their agile tariff in the market, and I think Greg said on your podcast recently, they lose a load of money on it, right? Because they're not the benefit they providing to the system, they're not being in any way rewarded for that, and there's no locational signals, etc. We've got a single half-hour price for the whole country, which doesn't reflect the fact that we now got hundreds of thousands, and we'll move to millions of actors going off in different places. So you haven't got those market signals going in. So if you're a consumer-facing business, then what's your incentive to bother to try and get something? Because I'm not of the view that consumers are going to be like maybe you and I, John, looking, let's see what's happened in the wholesale market today. Or what's going, or what's the forward curve? Questions like that. they just want a simple service. They want the lights to come on and be as efficient as possible, and a car to be charged up in the morning, etc. So you want somebody to be building smart offers on top of that, which make it as simple as possible for consumers. And then somebody smart is managing the system effects, etc., making sure the low voltage network is not going to, buckle under the strain of everyone in the cul-de-sac getting Teslas, etc. So you absolutely have to get those market signals, which are going to then create an incentive for people actually to come up with consumer-facing offers. Because right now, there's no point.
Is the benefit? Do you have a sense of how big the benefit is here? Just because I suppose one piece of evidence I haven't quite firmed up on is right. So household consumption is a reasonably small component of power consumption. You probably know the numbers. I would guess a third or something like that is consumed in houses. Maybe less. Then you've got industry. Then you've got other things. Household consumption of power is among the highest value consumption of power. We want it on demand.
Yeah.
When we want it, ready to go all the time. We don't want to think, as you say, people aren't like you and I. They don't want to necessarily think about charging their car at 2 a.m. when the price is lowest. They just want a full tank of power as soon as possible from the power system. Do you have a sense of how big the benefit, whereas industrial processes, you might be able to flex those, right? And people are doing, producing steel, producing, in electricity intensive processes. Do we really need to be focusing on households? What gives you confidence that this is going to reduce the overall cost of the system?
So I'll try and answer that in a couple of ways. So first of all, the difference, there's a kind of perception in energy that we absolutely know what the power system is going to look like in 2030. And that's the fault of organizations like your and mine, who produce these incredibly glossy, compelling scenarios out to 2050. And people go, oh, brilliant, 16 gigawatts of nuclear power. That's the right answer. Or, 125 gigawatts of offshore wind.
I should warn everyone, we both Guys and my organizations will definitely be wrong on what they say that the system will look like in 2030. So
that's right. But of course we will always be a bloody caveat somewhere in the reports which will say that they are not forecasts, they are scenarios, etc. So and there's kind of sense, we know exactly what they'll be. But if you look at the difference in potential cost, we did some modeling recently and looked at various different versions of a 2050 power sector, and you've got a 30-40 billion pound a year swing in the different costs of what there will be, all based on our assumptions and things like that, just from the different tech options that you take. That's a kind of 30% difference in cost in the UK. So getting the right balance really, really matters. Yes, household demand on the electricity side is relatively small at the moment. But as you say, if you are electrifying more of your heating, which, even if you're bullish on the hydrogen heating side is likely, and you've got all these EVs coming on, and our lives are going to, I can't think of anyone's life who's becoming less electric, as it were. The number of devices kicking around my house at the moment is just, and they're getting more efficient, etc. But, it's going to become more and more important. If you don't unlock the potential of that for flexibility, whilst giving people the option of, I want to come home and I want to plug my car in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I don't care about anything else. Somebody else can sort out that system cost. You need, unless you've got the flexibility working both, domestic and non-domestic consumers, then, potentially got a much more expensive system than you need to, an over-engineered system. And, that's both damaging from a GDP point of view. It's back to your point earlier about, how do you make it as cost effective as possible? But it's also potentially damaging for the politics of net zero. I mean, I lived through the kind of aftermath of, a thing that David Cameron says he never says, which is the green crap comment, and the cut in subsidies, etc., because the political mood was actually these subsidies got too high for people's bills, and and that will, we're in a good position on climate change politics at the moment, but that'll come back at some stage. So and also we've got to make a compelling example to the rest of the world, right? You've got to say, actually, oh yeah, that's all right. That transition's not too bad. It's not a kind of rich world kind of indulgence. It's pretty practical. In fact, it's better. So let's go for it. That's the nature of the climate problem.
So, okay, interesting. So it's a sort of, and I don't use this word in a pejorative way. It's a slightly ideological perspective in the sense that, and I agree with this, by the way, the onus, if you want to move away from using price signals and dare I say it, markets, kind of the onus of proof is on the person who wants to move away from them in a sense, rather than the person who's advocating them. And a good one of the, there's all sorts of good arguments for that, but part of it is we don't know what the future looks like, but we know if we create markets for things we value, they will tend to come up with something that resembles the right answer. And I suppose the other ideological, and again, I don't use the word in a negative way, perspective there is, the onus of evidence is on someone who wants to spend government money on something, in a sense. If you can get a market to do it without spending money, then you really want a reason for spending money, in a sense. And a really good example, I think, that's very clear to people probably is the capacity mechanism, where a lot of countries have gone through the process of, well, should we have a strategic reserve? Should we have government pay money to pick particular plants in particular locations? Everyone thought the price would clear at twice the level it would. Everyone thought the technology keeping the lights on was different to the ones that have actually popped up. And in a sense, I think you could, if you wanted to do a study on the virtues of this, then perhaps that would be one good example of a market leading everyone to a solution that others hadn't anticipated with lower costs to consumers.
I think that's right, John. But of course, the challenge with the capacity mechanism as currently designed, and we kind of challenge it as a premise in the report. The capacity market in the UK, contracts for difference, they are quasi market mechanisms. They are making a lot of choices, as it were. But the challenge on the capacity mechanism is where the capacity crunch is going to be is not clear to us that it's going to be at the same point that it's traditionally been, which is cold February, 5 o'clock, and let's all plan for that, right? It's as likely to be in the middle of summer, where sudden wind,
solar eclipse,
or big cloud cover, or whatever it is, etc. And that's what one of the many fascinating things about the COVID situation is what we saw last year when there was a massive drop in demand. It's effectively a kind of postcard from the future. Renewables was suddenly a much greater percentage of what we're thinking, and you saw the ESO having to take some quite extreme measures and steps very fast to try and navigate that. And that's as we pile more and more renewables onto the system, which is a big supporter of that, we need the whole system to work together. And if we don't start thinking about how all those markets are going to incentivize the flexibility side so that it keeps up with the progress on the renewable side, then we could be getting ourselves into some difficulties.
Just on that one, and I want to get on to like a second point you make in the report where you say we want to avoid a perpetual reliance on government decision-making to drive technology choices. And this sounds a little bit like that. Just on that capacity one, I mean, we've got a power market price of, what is it, £6,000 a megawatt hour as a peak. We've got ancillary and balancing markets that reward you in excess of that when power is scarce. Do we really not have enough incentive? I mean, even if the capacity market only covers the winter 6 months of the year, is there really not enough incentive to build a power station for the solar eclipse when the wind's not blowing in summer at the moment?
There might well be. We do have a power market price, and you are getting some stuff built, kind of pure merchant, including some, plenty of solar's going up without needing to have a market, but it's not. There's no locational information on there, and that's where you do run into trouble at a national level in terms of security supply, but it's normally locationally that a particular part of the system is stressed, and right now there's not enough signals, although you get into ancillary markets and eventually the grid will pay for you to do that. But a much better way would be that actually we have that locational information in the wholesale price and different wholesale prices, and that then feeds through to people making investment choices. And all I would say though is that we do know, not least because of work from you and others, that the kind of piling on of CFDs and the capacity market is distorting the wholesale price. I mean, it's lower than it probably would be, and so therefore information is being taken out of the market signal. So it's not a stronger market signal. You would have thought, oh God, this should be fantastic signals for people to be building flexibility. And you're seeing some evidence of that. Is it on the scale we need to manage 40, 60, 70 gigawatts of offshore wind? We're not convinced yet. And if you talk to innovators in the market, they don't necessarily feel strong enough in that way.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So one of the recommendations in your report along the lines of this is to try to make markets work by more accurately capturing value in space and time.
Yeah.
Is there a tension here? And I look, I speak to people in the US, I speak to people in Australia where they have essentially, in the US, definitely in Australia, essentially, market-based locational pricing in a very strong way that's tied to the market. Is there a risk here, do you think, when you advocate? I should say, by the way, in GB, we do quite a lot of location-based pricing, right? Yep. It's not quite in the market. There's a regime called TNUoS. If you build near London, you at least historically you would get paid for building near a demand centre, and if you build in northern Scotland, you would pay and decent chunks of money. It's like £30 a kilowatt per annum or something like that if you're right up in the north. Is there a risk here that you put too much risk onto developers and investors? If I'm about to deploy £200 million on a wind farm in wherever it is, the northwest of England, and I don't know what the locational value of wind in that location will be. It will be a function of who builds there after me, and how much they constrain the network. It will be a function of how much the network company or investors build network to that place in the future. Does that almost start to put too much risk on someone who's developing renewable assets? And could we get a lot more, is that a natural, given that part of it's about network design and decisions by the regulator that's going to determine the locational value of my power, would this be a bit risk in some ways that would be, do we need to strike a middle ground and say, look, fair enough, government and consumers ultimately should bear some of that locational risk?
Ultimately, all these market design questions are a balance of risk between various different parties, and you absolutely have to be thinking through where it is appropriate that risk is held. But you also have to be, your objective. The objective of your energy policy is not simply taking risk away from developers. Developers should be wearing some, it's this case of where is the appropriate balance. I think our argument would be that it's shifted a bit too much in favor of developers who, when the cost of capital is, 2% or whatever, you're thinking to yourself, well, hold on, is that now, of course, some people argue, well, of course, climate change is such an existential threat. We know roughly what the power sector is going to look like. It's all a cost of capital gain.
Yeah, let's just get moving.
That's certainly the kind of is the intellectual argument for the EMR, by the way, which I'm generally supportive of. But I think as we shift into a world where that penetration of renewables gets higher and higher, and if we're not providing market signals to people on the flexibility side in a practical way, then there are system risks from that. There are kind of overbuilding risks. We have an over-engineered system, and the cost effects, all of that we've discussed earlier. You need, so it always is. Is there a way of revealing, the appropriate balance? Now, our view on the kind of how do you decarbonize the amount of low carbon power you're going to need, right? And you're going to need a huge increase. Our analysis would agree with yours. You're looking at a doubling of the electricity system by, at least a doubling of the electricity system by 2050, and actually that might be even faster with the sixth carbon budget, etc. So you still need a very significant driver of low carbon deployment, and we tend to prefer a kind of obligation approach, a switch to an obligation on carbon, and let the technologies compete. Other people, argue that, well, let's just keep CFDs piling onto the system, and then that other prices will pop up elsewhere, which will give simulation. But I think that's a riskier approach in my view.
Okay, great. I'd like to come to that obligation point in a second.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that you want to balance these things. And I think we all, from my perspective, need to start from the point that unfortunately financial markets are incomplete. People won't build assets on the assumption that they'll get a massive payoff once every 5 years or every 10 years. And I think, locational hedges, once you get very specific, are just impossible to find in financial markets. So there is from a completeness of markets perspective, I think there is some role of government, which is where it gets a bit messy. But you do tend to have these kind of warring factions. One is, yes, climate change means we need to be on a war footing for 10 to 20 years and a strong hand of government. And the economists often saying, guys, let's just let markets do this. They're going to be much cheaper. And I, at least I'm convinced, and it sounds like your view as well, is that the answer is somewhere in the middle.
I think that's right. But I think, we are, in the UK context, we are drifting is probably the word I would use, towards, more and more effectively central planning, like, people in government making decisions about what the electricity mix should look like. And I think that's a really risky approach to take. And I think what we're trying to argue for in our report is that how many of those decisions can realistically be made in markets to reveal competitive tension, not just how good your lobbying is, as it were. And I think that tension, you can really see it in the energy white paper in the UK. You can see that tension between, we need to deploy 40 gigawatts by 2030. That's a government commitment, and but what about all this smart stuff that we're gonna have to unlock? So it of course it's a spectrum, and it's gonna, markets are all social constructs, right? When it's kind of, there's not some magic apart from that, particularly energy markets. But I think our view is that we should be trying to move it in the other direction in terms of central planning versus market.
Yeah, and just as it's hard to envisage what additional benefits markets will unlock, which different technology, which different contract or customer solution, there tends to be, as you say, an assumption that government just gets it right. And certainly your former organisation, Policy Exchange, I think it was when Aurora's Richard Howard was there, did some good analysis on the costs to consumers of early tariffs. It was £250 a kilowatt, £250 a megawatt hour for rooftop solar. Some of those feeder contracts for early stage renewables were certainly phenomenally expensive. Okay, excellent. You mentioned one other thing, and then I want to start asking about whether some concepts are over or underrated. But one other topic you said was about outcome-based policy mandates. And so essentially, just to, as I understand it, what you would do is you would go to essentially power suppliers or retailers and say, look, you need to supply power that is 60% renewables. You need to supply power that is definitely there even at the peak of demand, and that we'll get some certificates or some penalties or something like that. That means you have to do that. The one question I have for you, and this has been popular all over the world. Biden's thinking about that in the US. Australia had a policy along those lines, which didn't survive in a former government. One question I have is, suddenly the government's not the counterparty, and it seems to me that having government as the counterparty for capacity contracts or CFD renewables contracts enabled all sorts of people to enter from all over the place. It was this great leveler for competition. Anyone can enter a CFD auction, because once you've got that contract, you can go to a bank, you can borrow money, and that was great. Is there a risk in having these mandates that you go back to a world in which the gatekeepers are the retailers and the supply companies, which I think is a naturally an industry with natural economies of scale? You move back to vertical integration and in that direction. What do you say to that sort of challenge around these sorts of mandates?
So there's a few things in there. I mean, I think what you're trying to do with the kind of obligation or mandate or standards on the supplier or the off taker, increasing tightening of standards over time, clear visibility to say, by 2035, probably in line with the CCC, 100% of your power supply is going to have to be low carbon, which is what we're advocating. And what you're doing there is you are going to be making suppliers a probably more sophisticated part of the market than they are at the moment. Where it's become with a few exceptions and some fantastic innovations, but largely a kind of commodity play. Like get your billing right, get your trading right, get your customer service right. And off you go, and we've got however many 60 odd suppliers in the market. I think the world we're likely moving towards, where you're going to have much more kind of consumer facing offerings and serviced energy offerings. We're talking about heat as a service and things like that. That's a very different risk profile from what you've got at the moment. And so it's likely, I would suspect, you don't know, because you're going to see what happens with innovation, that would lead to a more sophisticated kind of retail energy supply market, which I think is a good thing, right? I think that's what we want, and that's going to be part of that is going to be consumer facing, part of that is going to be system facing. So they have greater responsibilities there. Now that is going to be a different set of business models to what you've got at the moment. You're going to need, you're going to be able to need to manage more risk, and you're going to have to move. You're going to move through there. So it would be surprising if there were still 60 players in there. But what is likely is the supplier becomes a hub for lots of other innovators to build off there. But you have potentially a kind of more service-based offering, which is going to manage the policy obligations, the market needs, and the consumer offerings in that. And that's a really exciting vision for me, and might get us past this kind of price cap. The whole success of the energy market is switching, etc. Which there's great things in that. You want it to be vibrant, but it feels like it's not fit for what we need it to be for the next phase of the transition.
Do you think it moves us closer to vertical integration?
Yeah, I think there's probably the return of that logic. CFDs, there's not much point for kind of vertical integration, right? You don't need that. You don't need the counterparty risk of a load of customers, as it were, to match your profile. I think that could be the case. I'm very reluctant always to predict how these things will work out, but you're seeing hints of that. Octopus buying up some, or joining up with 2 bits of the Octopus family. In that sense, you're seeing, good have always had that relationship, and it kind of makes sense, really, especially if you want to get that balancing working in a particular way.
Yeah, interesting. Just one more question. And this is sort of with your political hat on. Do you think Zoom forward 5 years from now? Action on climate, net zero targets is a bipartisan issue in the UK. Everyone agrees it's a good idea. Do you think 5 years from now there'll be as much agreement on decarbonisation as there is right now, or do you think we're sort of at a peak? You're seeing some resistance on the decarbonisation, gas boilers in the Conservative Party, these types of things. Do you think we're at a peak of the bipartisanship on this topic?
So I'm a political, I've been a political advisor, so I'm paranoid as hell. So I'm constantly looking around corners for trouble, and I see quite a lot of trouble as it were. It's not inevitable, but the kind of interjection into the debate around heating. If I was trying to, to be frank, if I was trying to stall progress on climate change action, I'd be thinking about heating for all the reasons we talked about at the start, right? It's potentially significant change to consumers. They're not ready for it yet. Unfamiliar technology, potentially some quite big price tags, etc. And that brings you back to the point: is how you avoid creating the kind of climate wars in the UK, which has been a brilliant bipartisan success, and huge credit to people on both sides. How do you avoid that? You've got to make sure that when you're switching to low carbon heating, you're making it easy for people, and you're being upfront. We're gonna, it's and that's about a policy design question as well as a political narrative. Because if we get that wrong, I don't want to be too, inject too much hyperbole into the concept, but if we get that wrong and people reject low carbon solutions, whether it's heat networks or heat pumps or hydrogen, etc., all of which have consumer barriers to them, then it won't happen. The politicians will eventually step away from it. So I really think it's a fascinating time politically, and if we're not very mindful of consumers and put consumers first, making it easy for people to do the transition, then we'll struggle.
Yeah. I certainly detect some complacency, and who wouldn't be after the decade we've had in Europe? But look to the US, certainly Australia. When decarbonisation is a partisan issue, you can eliminate a lot of progress very quickly, and you can stall progress very quickly as well. I think so. I think people may underestimate that in Europe, at least, given the decade we've had. So Guy, I'd like to conclude by asking you about a few topics and asking you whether you think they're overrated or underrated in the energy transition. And I suppose over or underrated by a reasonably well-informed, member of the profession in general, right? So the first one is the role of consumers in providing system flexibility in the power system. Do you think that's overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated, but I also think it's massive uncertainty. I mean, the potential, we all look at a model, but we don't really know how consumers will behave. I mean, domestic consumers and commercial consumers. I think it's the most exciting and uncertain question.
Okay, interesting. Second concept: the social costs of getting to net zero across the whole economy. Overrated or underrated?
I think it's underrated. Okay. I really worry about it.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, very interesting. People talk about 1 or 2% of GDP, which is not a small amount of money, by the way. 1 or 2% of GDP in 2050 and subsequently. Okay. Third
it's
one.
Where those costs fall, John.
Well,
It's where those costs fall. That's the yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a tough political question. Third one, the performance. So this is an interesting one based on your past experience. The performance of the Energy Secretary of State in improving social welfare. So in a sense, what I mean here is you can have a great Secretary of State, right? in a dysfunctional system, they will not be able to implement change no matter how clever or hardworking they are. In a well-functioning system, they could have a disproportionate impact. So I'm asking about the person rather than the role. Do you think the performance of the Secretary of State of Energy is overrated or underrated in terms of impacting social outcomes?
In the system we've got, it's underrated. I mean, in a very centralized decision-making system, as we're kind of drifting towards, as I said, the role of what the Secretary of State, having a good Secretary of State is massive, because they're making so many decisions, or signing off so many decisions. I think that's part of the reason, frankly, why, and this is no disrespect to the people I work with who are fantastic. It's just, how do we get as many decisions out of Whitehall as possible? Because they just can't know the answers to some of these questions. They're unknowable.
And is there an asymmetry there? Is it that you could hurt social welfare a lot with the wrong decisions, or is it that you could enhance it a lot with the right decisions? Maybe that's
you can absolutely hurt social welfare. If you're picking the wrong technology, etc. It's extremely risky.
Yeah. And I've also seen instances where you pick the wrong governance or something like that, and it throws you off for a decade or something like that. I think there are examples of that. Okay, and then finally,
I think that's right.
Yeah. And finally, the UK's ability to benefit from the energy transition globally. We hear a lot about the UK being a beneficiary globally, exporting technology. Do you think the UK's ability to benefit from the energy transition globally is overrated or underrated?
That's such a difficult question. I think it's overrated in some sectors and underrated in others. I don't think we have a really clear view of what the UK is, and this is not just an energy point, this is kind of industrial strategy point, I guess. What are we really good at? Not what we want to be good at. There's quite a lot of that in politics, thinking we're going to be world leaders in X, Y, and Z. I'm extraordinarily excited about the companies large and small in the UK and their engineering expertise and their consumer-facing smarts and all of that. I'm also, by the way, really excited about one of the thing that the UK is brilliant at is market design and standards and all the kind of slightly unsexy stuff of innovation. And we should definitely be thinking about that and exporting that. I do worry we kind of wish ourselves into thinking we're going to be world leader in X technology, which is where it's not always justified, because there are other countries that are just always going to be us on that because they've got a better starting point. Yeah.
Interesting. And presumably you would add to your list of things we're good at that sort of retail supplier software bit where we could be, and you would add to your list of things we're not good at house insulation, among other things. So if you're out there trying to export Britain's standards of house insulation, then it could be an uphill battle.
One thing I'd just like to add, if you don't mind, John, is just a huge thanks to my colleagues Sarah Keybright and George Day, who did all the heavy lifting on this report and all the hard thinking. This is based on years of stuff we've been working on at the Catapult, conversations with innovators, and really thinking about what future electricity market. But it's those two who did all the hard work, so they deserve the full credit.
Wonderful. Well, that's a natural note to finish on, Guy. It was a pleasure. It was great to have someone on the show where we could really go deep on a bunch of market design questions, and the time really flew by. So Guy Newey, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
Thanks, John.
That was John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora, speaking to Guy Newey, director of strategy and performance at Energy Systems Catapult. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.